The strangest thing Joni Mitchell said that night was not about music. It was March 29, 2026, in Hamilton, Ontario. She was 82 years old, walking carefully beneath the lights, accepting an honor meant to summarize a lifetime that had never fit neatly inside anyone else's summary. The room rose for her. People applauded the albums, the paintings, the songs they had carried through marriages, departures, long drives, hospital rooms. Then Joni spoke about the catastrophe, not dramatically, almost lightly. Years earlier, she said, an aneurysm had changed her life, oddly, for the better. For the better. The sentence should have sounded impossible. In March 2015, she had been found unconscious at her home in Los Angeles. There was a coma, a long recovery. Abilities once so natural that nobody would think to name them had to be approached again, speaking, walking, finding her way back toward music. The woman who had once controlled microscopic changes in rhythm and pitch was suddenly living inside a body that would not simply obey. And yet, 11 years later, she stood before an audience and called it a transformation. She joked that the coma had helped her quit smoking. She spoke warmly of the nurses who filled her home. After years of traveling through a world crowded with men, she said, she now lived in a house full of women. People laughed. But listen closely, and the laughter leaves something unresolved. Was she softening the memory for the room? Was it the humor of someone who refuses to let strangers decide how her suffering should be described? Or had the worst event of her life truly given her something she had never known how to ask for? That question matters because Joni Mitchell had spent decades protecting her independence with almost frightening precision. She changed musical direction when audiences begged her to remain familiar. She resisted labels, expectations, the pressure to keep performing the version of herself that sold most easily. She painted her own covers, shaped her own arrangements, walked away when admiration began to feel like possession. Control was not merely part of her work, it was shelter. Then, without negotiation, the shelter disappeared. There is a room in this story that the public did not see, not the stage in Hamilton, not Newport, not the Grammy ceremony where millions watched her sing Both Sides Now, with a voice aged into something deeper than the song's young writer could have imagined. A quieter room, her home. Musicians began gathering there during the years after the aneurysm. At first, the music did not belong to a comeback plan. There were no tickets, no reviews, no cameras waiting for a triumphant ending. Friends came to play. Songs Joni had written decades earlier returned to her through other people's mouths. Imagine that. You created the melody. You chose where the breath should fall. You knew the private wound beneath a single word. Now someone else is carrying it across the room to you. Maybe that was comforting. Maybe it was unbearable. No one there could know exactly which part of Joni was listening. The songwriter, the patient, the woman trying to recognize a life that everyone around her remembered with painful clarity. Something happened during those gatherings. Slowly, she began joining in. A line here, a harmony, a song. Later, an instrument placed back into her hands. The public would eventually call what followed a return. But return is a convenient word. It suggests a person leaves, then comes back to the same place. Joni did not come back to the same place. She could not. The voice had changed. The body had changed. Time had moved through every song. Even the audience had changed. Many were now old enough to hear their own losses inside words they once understood only as beautiful. And perhaps that is why her statement in Hamilton felt so unsettling. She did not say the catastrophe had been defeated. She said life became better because of it. The applause continued. Joni smiled. The ceremony moved forward. But the question remained behind. What did she have to lose before she could say that? And which part of her never returned at all? Long before the world learned Joni Mitchell's name, a hospital room had already taught her what it felt like to be left behind. She was 9 years old when polio reached her small world in Saskatchewan. It was 1952. Winter was closing in, and there was no vaccine available to protect children from the disease. Her body, once quick and athletic, weakened. She was taken away from home and placed in an isolation ward, separated from the ordinary life continuing outside. Christmas approached. Other children expected gifts, familiar voices, perhaps the sound of footsteps coming down a hallway. Joni later remembered asking the hospital staff whether she would be allowed to go home for Christmas. She was told she could not, so she made a private bargain. She promised herself that if she could walk again, she would sing. It sounds almost too perfect now, knowing what her voice would eventually become. But there was no audience then, no guitar, no albums waiting in the future. Just a frightened child trying to negotiate with a body that had suddenly become unreliable. She recovered enough to leave, but polio did not vanish cleanly. Weakness remained in her left hand, later contributing to the unusual guitar tunings that became part of her musical identity. What listeners would one day praise as innovation partly grew from adaptation, a young woman finding another route because the conventional one did not fit her body. That pattern would return, not healing exactly, improvisation. By 21, she was no longer the child in the isolation ward. She was Joan Anderson, an art student with little money and an uncertain future, moving through Canadian coffee houses while trying to become someone before the world decided what a woman like her was permitted to be. Then she became pregnant. The father, a former boyfriend named Brad McMath, did not build a life with her. Joni left art school. She moved east carrying a secret that could alter every opportunity available to an unmarried woman in 1964. This was not California in the age of confessional singer-songwriters. There was no famous name to protect her, no income from songs, no home prepared for a child. Respectability still determined which doors opened and which quietly closed. Pregnancy outside marriage could become not only a private crisis, but a public identity. In Toronto, on February 19, 1965, she gave birth to a daughter. She named her Kelly Dale Anderson. For months, Joni tried to find a way to keep her. She performed where she could. She lived with almost nothing. She searched for stability before time made the decision for her. But poverty can make love feel powerless. Eventually, Kelly was placed for adoption. The separation would remain hidden from the public for nearly 3 decades. Joni continued moving. She married folk singer Chuck Mitchell that same year, took the surname the world would remember, and crossed into the United States. The marriage did not last, the name did. The child remained elsewhere, and here the story becomes less comfortable than the familiar legend of an artist turning pain into beauty. Because Joni did write about her daughter. She wrote Little Green, but she did not immediately tell the world what the song contained. Listeners heard seasons, tenderness, sadness, a child given a color for a name. They could feel the loss without knowing whose loss it was. That silence protected Joni. It also trapped her. Imagine performing a grief people admire without being able to admit that it is yours. Strangers praise the beauty of the song. They ask what inspired it. They carry it into their own lives. Meanwhile, the person at its center is growing up somewhere else. Joni became skilled at leaving before a place could hold her. Saskatchewan. Art school. Toronto. A marriage. Later, musical scenes, relationships, entire versions of her career. People would call it restlessness. Perhaps some of it was. But once you have learned that survival may require surrendering what you love most, departure can begin to feel safer than dependence. In 1993, the secret of the adoption reached the press after someone who had known Joni during her art school years sold the story to a tabloid. What had remained encoded in music was suddenly public property. Joni began searching openly. Her daughter, now named Kilauren Gibb, was searching too. They would eventually find each other in 1997, more than 30 years after the separation. But reunion is another convenient word. It makes lost time sound as though it can simply be returned. It cannot. Before we reach that meeting, there is something else to understand. Joni's most intimate songs did not begin when she became famous enough to confess. They began when telling the whole truth could still cost her everything. And once millions of people fell in love with those songs, the secret no longer belonged only to the woman who had lived it. By the time Joni Mitchell made Blue, people had already begun confusing access with understanding. They heard the trembling openness in her voice and assumed she had removed every wall. The songs sounded too intimate to be protected, too exposed to contain anything hidden. But that was the illusion. In 1971, Joni was 27. famous enough to be watched closely and still young enough to be surprised by what fame demanded. Her songs had traveled far beyond the rooms where they were written. Other singers recorded them. Listeners treated her words like private letters somehow addressed to them. And Joni was pulling away. She had ended a relationship with Graham Nash, leaving behind the possibility of a settled domestic life. The decision was not clean or painless. Nash had imagined a future built around a home, ordinary mornings and permanence. Joni loved him, but permanence carried another meaning for her. It could become a room with no exit. She traveled through Europe, Greece, Spain, France, places where fewer people knew exactly what they expected her to be. Distance did not erase the questions waiting at home, but it changed their volume. Then she wrote, not explanations, fragments, a river she wished she could skate away on, a lover remembered with tenderness and damage mixed together, a child hidden inside a song that many listeners still did not fully understand. Freedom presented not as triumph, but as something that could wound everyone nearby. Blue appeared in June 1971. There were no elaborate arrangements protecting the voice. Often it was only Joni, a piano or dulcimer, and the unsettling feeling that the listener had entered a room without knocking. That feeling became part of the album's power. It also created a problem. The more vulnerable Joni sounded, the more people believed they knew her. Critics praised the honesty. Musicians recognized something almost frightening in it. Chris Christopherson reportedly told her to save something for herself. But what exactly had she revealed? The songs contained emotion without providing a complete record of events. Names shifted, moments blurred together. One relationship could enter a song beside the memory of another. Confession became composition. The pain was real. The map was not. This distinction mattered to Joni, even when audiences ignored it. A song could tell an emotional truth while refusing to become courtroom evidence. Yet listeners searched for identities behind every line. Former lovers became characters. Characters became explanations. The life and the work were pulled closer together until separating them seemed almost dishonest. You can understand why people did it. When someone describes loneliness with that much precision, you want to believe you have reached the person beneath the voice. But perhaps Blue was not Joni opening a door. Perhaps it was her controlling exactly how much of the room could be seen. She gave the public sorrow shaped into melody. She chose the pauses, the images, the point where each confession ended. And still the album escaped her control. Decades later, people would call it one of the most emotionally revealing records ever made. They would play it after separations, during illness, in bedrooms where nobody else could hear them cry. Joni had turned private instability into something millions could use. That was the triumph. It may also have been the trap. Because once the world decides that your most wounded self is your truest self, healing can begin to look like betrayal. And Joni Mitchell was already preparing to become someone her listeners might not recognize. The audience thought Blue had brought them closer to Joni Mitchell. What they did not yet understand was that closeness made her uneasy. Success had created a strange expectation around her. People wanted honesty, but only in a familiar form. They wanted the open tunings, the delicate voice, the romantic damage arranged beautifully enough to survive repeated listening. They wanted Joni to keep returning to the emotional room where they had first found her. She could have remained there. The industry would have rewarded it. Instead, she began removing the furniture. The change was not immediate enough to look like rebellion, for the Roses still carried intimacy. Court and Spark, released in 1974, widened the sound with fuller arrangements and jazz-inflected musicianship while remaining accessible enough to become her greatest commercial success. For a brief moment, experimentation and popularity occupied the same space. That moment did not last. Joni had become increasingly interested in rhythmic freedom, unusual harmonies and musicians who could respond without simply decorating a singer-songwriter's confession. She listened beyond the boundaries others had drawn around her. Jazz was not a costume she suddenly put on. It offered something she needed, movement without apology. But movement has consequences. In 1975, the hissing of summer lawns arrived, sounding less like a private diary than a series of rooms observed from uncomfortable angles. Suburban marriage, wealth, desire hidden beneath polished surfaces. Women surrounded by comfort and quietly disappearing inside it. Some listeners were confused, others felt abandoned. The woman they believed had spoken directly from her heart was now using distance, characters, layered rhythms, and social observation. The emotional signals were still there, but they no longer arrived with instructions. That mattered. Joni was beginning to expose a contradiction in the relationship between artist and audience. People often say they want growth. What they frequently want is repetition, with just enough difference to feel new. She refused. Then came Hejira in 1976, an album shaped by highways, temporary rooms, and movement across America. The songs did not ask to be entered quickly. They wandered. They doubled back. Jaco Pastorius's bass moved through them like another consciousness. Joni sounded alone, but not helpless. That difference may have unsettled listeners more than heartbreak ever had. A wounded woman could be understood. A woman choosing solitude was harder to contain. You can hear it in the way she wrote about travel. Roads were not merely escapes from lovers or obligations. They became places where identity loosened. No one waiting at the next town had known her long enough to insist on an older version. But even freedom developed its own loneliness. Hotel rooms, passing landscapes, conversations that ended before intimacy hardened into expectation. Joni had escaped the cage people built from blue. Now she was discovering that constant departure could become another kind of enclosure. Her work moved further toward jazz. She collaborated with musicians whose language challenged the categories that had made her famous. When she worked with Charles Mingus near the end of his life, the project carried enormous artistic weight and almost no promise of commercial safety. Mingus appeared in 1979, months after his death. Many longtime fans did not know what to do with it. The record did not offer a comforting return. Neither did the tour that followed. Joni appeared with extraordinary jazz musicians, but parts of the public still arrived hoping to hear the woman frozen inside earlier songs. There were nights when applause and resistance seemed to occupy the same room. This is where the familiar version of her story often becomes too simple. It says, Joni bravely followed her artistic instincts, while critics failed to understand her. That is partly true, but courage does not cancel doubt. She noticed the rejection. She read the criticism. She understood when sales changed and when audiences became impatient. Independence did not make her immune to being misunderstood. It only meant she was unwilling to purchase approval by becoming predictable. And perhaps there was something more personal beneath the musical changes. After years of having strangers search her songs for evidence about her lovers, her daughter, and her private wounds, complexity became protection. The arrangements grew denser. The characters became harder to reduce. The music demanded that listeners stop assuming every line was a key to her private life. She had once hidden a devastating truth inside a beautiful song. Now she was hiding in plain sight. The public called it reinvention. Critics called it difficult. Some fans called it a mistake. Joni kept moving. Yet every road away from the woman people loved seemed to make that woman more valuable. Blue grew larger in memory. The younger voice became sacred. The vulnerability she had escaped was preserved forever, waiting on vinyl. She could change. The recording could not. And as the years passed, Joni would face a disturbing possibility. Perhaps the public did not want to know who she was becoming. Perhaps they only wanted her to return to the person she had survived. Before the aneurysm, Joni Mitchell had already begun disappearing. Not completely. She still attended exhibitions, spoke in interviews, and occasionally allowed the public to see her. But music no longer seemed to occupy the center of her life. Her last album of new material, Shine, arrived in 2007. Touring had ended years earlier. Painting, once forced into the background by success, had moved forward again. To outsiders, it looked like retirement. To Joni, it was less orderly. She spoke bitterly about the music business, about unpaid value imitation, and an industry that had learned to package rebellion while punishing independence. She had spent decades refusing to repeat herself. Now the industry seemed increasingly interested in repeating her without needing her presence. Tributes grew, rankings improved. Younger artists called her an influence with a reverence that sometimes made her sound less like a living woman than a monument already being prepared. Joni did not always receive that reverence gently. She could be funny, severe, suspicious, wounded. Praise did not erase old resentments. Recognition arriving late could feel uncomfortably close to an apology no one intended to make, and her body was becoming harder to ignore. She publicly described suffering from morgellons, a disputed condition she said produced agonizing sensations and made ordinary life nearly impossible. At times, she spoke of leaving music to fight for people whose symptoms were dismissed. Whatever outsiders believed about the diagnosis, her distress was real to her. She felt trapped inside a body others could discuss more easily than she could escape. The voice had changed too. Years of smoking had lowered and roughened it. Some listeners mourned the high, floating sound of her early records, but Joni had never sounded interested in preserving youth for their comfort. She used the deeper voice differently, allowing age to enter songs that had once carried the uncertainty of a young woman. Still, appearances became rare. The distance created rumors. Each photograph was examined. Each absence became evidence. Fans wondered whether she was ill, angry, finished, or simply unwilling to perform reassurance for strangers. Perhaps she was all of those things at different moments. That is what makes March 31, 2015 so difficult to approach. The catastrophe did not interrupt a conventional comeback. There was no tour underway, no new album waiting, no triumphant public chapter suddenly stolen. Instead, it entered a life already withdrawing from view. Joni was found unconscious at her Los Angeles home and taken to a hospital. Early reports were confused. Friends offered conflicting impressions. The public waited outside a silence it could not interpret. For decades she had chosen when to leave the room. Now the choice had been taken from her. The woman who had resisted becoming a memory was suddenly being remembered in real time while still alive behind hospital walls. And before anyone knew whether she would speak, walk, or sing again, another unsettling question appeared. Had the world noticed her absence only after it became impossible for her to return? For a while, the large room in Joni Mitchell's house was silent. The instruments were still there. Her paintings covered the walls. The piano had not forgotten anything. Neither had the guitars. But Joni's body had. After the 2015 aneurysm, recovery followed a strict, exhausting rhythm. Walking and speaking, actions that once required no conscious planning, had become work. Singing was not the priority. Playing an instrument seemed even farther away. This was not the dramatic silence of an artist refusing the stage. It was quieter than that. Music remained inside the house, but the woman who had shaped every unusual chord could no longer reach it in the same way. Then, in April 2017, singer-songwriter Eric Anderson called. He was visiting Los Angeles with musicians and wondered whether they might come to Joni's home and play. It was a small suggestion, almost ordinary. No one described it as the beginning of a comeback. They gathered in the room while Joni sat in a reclining chair. Anderson had known her long before Blue, before the mythology, before millions of strangers memorized her private language. Now he played while she listened. She swayed. That detail matters more than it first appears. Before she sang, before she held a guitar, before the public could celebrate anything, her body responded to rhythm. Afterward, Joni told her friend and assistant, Marcy Gensick, that they should do it again. Gensick agreed. They would call it a Joni Jam. The name sounded playful, but the early gatherings carried an emotional imbalance no one could easily discuss. Musicians entered Joni Mitchell's home knowing her work had shaped their lives. Some had learned to write by listening to her. Some had fallen in love through her songs. Now they were singing those songs back to her. What do you do with that kind of responsibility? You cannot perform too casually, but reverence can be dangerous too. Treat someone like a monument long enough, and you may forget she is still sitting in the room, listening for the wrong note. At first, Joni mostly watched. There was wine, conversation, familiar melodies. Younger artists beside musicians she had known for decades. The gatherings slowly became more regular, and the room that had gone silent began holding sound again. Not pressure sound. That distinction may have saved something. No manager was demanding an album. No promoter had announced a date. Joni was not being asked to prove she was still Joni Mitchell. She could listen without promising that listening would lead anywhere. Then one evening she joined them. The first song she reportedly sang during a Joni jam was George Gershwin's Summertime. Not one of her own songs, perhaps that made it safer. There was no younger version of herself waiting inside the recording. No audience comparing the voice in the room to the clear soprano preserved decades earlier. Just an old standard. A beginning borrowed from someone else. From there, the changes came in fragments. She sang a little more. She began participating instead of only receiving the music. Eventually, instruments returned to her hands. But guitar presented a cruel problem. Joni's unusual tunings had always depended on physical memory, on fingers knowing routes that conventional players often struggled to follow. After the aneurysm, that map was no longer fully available. She had to study recordings of herself. Think about the strangeness of that. A woman watching her own hands from years earlier, trying to learn from the person she used to be. Most musicians imitate their heroes when they begin. Joni Mitchell had to imitate Joni Mitchell. Brandi Carlile became increasingly important in the circle around her. Their friendship deepened after Joni's 75th birthday tribute in 2018. Carlile helped organize gatherings, bring musicians together, and protect the atmosphere in which Joni could participate without the evening becoming a public test. Soon rumors escaped the living room. Joni was singing again. Fans wanted to believe it, but belief could become another demand. A private recovery was already being transformed into a possible return before Joni had promised anyone a stage. Inside the house, the songs continued. Sometimes she led, sometimes others carried the difficult passages. Voices gathered around hers rather than pretending nothing had changed. That may have been the deepest reversal of all. For most of her life, Joni had escaped whenever belonging threatened her independence. Now dependence was allowing her to recover something independence alone could not restore. The music came back through other people, and once it did, a dangerous idea entered the room. Perhaps the songs did not have to remain there, but no one, not Brandi, not the musicians, perhaps not even Joni, yet knew whether carrying that fragile circle into public would complete the recovery, or expose everything that had not returned. The audience at Newport did not know whether Joni Mitchell would sing. On July 24, 2022, Brandi Carlile walked onto the stage at Fort Adams with a group of musicians and recreated the feeling of those private gatherings in Joni's living room. The festival audience believed they were watching a tribute. Then Joni appeared. The reaction arrived before the music. People stood. Some covered their mouths. Others cried at the sight of her sitting among the musicians, smiling as though thousands of strangers had somehow entered her home without warning. Only a small circle had known she might come. Even the organizers could not be certain she would step onto the stage until she made the decision herself. That uncertainty remained after she sat down. Would she sing an entire song? Would the others carry most of the performance? Would the moment become uncomfortable beneath the weight of everyone's expectations? At first, the musicians gathered around her as they had in Los Angeles. They offered support, without pretending she needed none. Voices entered beside hers. Brandi watched closely. The arrangement allowed Joni to disappear for a line, then return when she was ready. It was not the kind of performance audiences had once expected from her. That was precisely why it mattered. When Joni began both sides now, the voice that emerged was lower, slower, and physically marked by time. The young woman who had written the song had treated age and experience as mysteries still waiting ahead. Now an older woman was singing those same words after illness had taken away parts of the life she assumed would always remain available. The song had not changed, its witness had. People called the performance triumphant. It was her first full-length public concert in more than 2 decades, and her first appearance at Newport since the late 1960s. The 13-song set later became the live album Joni Mitchell at Newport. But triumph can hide the mechanics of survival. Joni remained seated. Other voices surrounded her. The musicians watched for signals most people in the audience would never notice. What sounded spontaneous had grown from years of private evenings in which she had been allowed to stop, listen, or join without disappointing anyone. The stage did not erase her dependence. It made dependence visible and somehow turned it into strength. Then in February 2024, she appeared at the Grammy Awards. It was her first performance on the Grammy telecast, despite a career that had shaped generations of artists already sitting in the room. She was 80 years old, seated in a white and gold chair, surrounded again by Brandi Carlile and members of the Joni Jam. She sang Both Sides Now, again. Perhaps no other song could carry the contradiction. It had been written by someone young enough to admit she did not understand life. Now it was being sung by someone old enough to know that understanding never arrives in the form we expect. The camera found famous faces crying. For viewers at home, the performance seemed almost impossibly complete. The survivor, the song, the standing ovation. The story appeared to have reached its ending. It had not. 8 months later, Joni returned to Los Angeles for 2 expansive Joni Jam concerts at the Hollywood Bowl, her first headlining shows in the city in 24 years. She performed deep cuts, familiar songs, and material the public never expected to hear from her again. Around her were Brandi Carlile, Annie Lennox, Elton John, Jon Batiste, Marcus Mumford, and others. The private circle had become a 3-hour public spectacle, yet its original design remained. Joni was at the center, but she was not alone. For most of her career, artistic control had meant resisting interference. Now control looked different. It meant choosing whom to trust, allowing another voice to hold a line, accepting help without surrendering authorship. Perhaps that was the real return, not the moment she sang, but the moment she stopped treating dependence as disappearance. Still, something in the applause was unsettling. The crowd was celebrating the recovery of Joni Mitchell. But which Joni did they believe had returned? The young confessor preserved on blue, the restless musician who had once fled every category, or the older woman now surrounded by people, singing more slowly because time had altered what the words could contain. The audience rose again. Joni smiled and accepted the love. But behind every standing ovation waited a question no performance could settle. Were they welcoming the woman she had become, or thanking her for briefly resembling the woman they had been afraid to lose? In March 2026, Joni Mitchell returned to Canada, carrying a sentence no one else could have written for her. She was 82, seated beneath the lights at the Juno Awards in Hamilton, receiving a Lifetime Achievement honor from a country she had left decades earlier, but never entirely escaped. The applause recognized 19 studio albums, 6 decades of influence and songs that had become part of other people's emotional histories. Then she returned to the aneurysm. She spoke of the coma, of quitting smoking, of the nurses who entered her home and remained in her life. After spending so many years traveling with men, she joked, she now lived in a house filled with women. Her life had changed for the better, she said, out of a catastrophe, like a phoenix. It was a beautiful image, perhaps too beautiful. A phoenix burns, disappears, and rises again. The symbol promises continuity. The creature that emerges is somehow still the creature that was lost. Human recovery is rarely that clean. Joni did not rise with the same body, the same voice, or the same freedom she possessed before March 2015. She did not simply wake from a coma and resume the interrupted song. Years passed. Friends gathered. Nurses helped her through ordinary movements the public would never applaud. Musicians carried melodies into her home until she could begin carrying parts of them herself. Even then, nothing returned exactly as it had been. The voice that once moved like light across impossible intervals had descended into a darker place. Her performances became slower. A line that once sounded curious could now sound final. Words written by a young woman gained meanings their author could not have anticipated. Listen to Both Sides Now in 1969, then listen to Joni sing it at the 2024 Grammys. The lyrics are identical. The truth is not. The younger voice observes illusion from the beginning of adulthood. The older voice seems to stand inside everything the song could not yet understand. Motherhood surrendered and recovered, love entered and abandoned, friendships lost, artistic battles survived, illness, dependence, and the humiliating patience of beginning again. People cried because they could hear time, but perhaps they were also crying for themselves. Older listeners did not simply see Joni survive. They saw what aging asks of everyone eventually, the surrender of some private certainty that the body will always carry us where the mind wishes to go. They saw help being accepted publicly. They saw dignity without the disguise of complete independence. That may be why her return felt larger than music. And still, calling it a return leaves something out. The woman on stage was not trying to reproduce the young Joni perfectly. She could not. Maybe she no longer wanted to. For decades, she had resisted audiences who treated blue as her permanent address. Now age and illness had made imitation impossible. The public finally had to meet her where she was, not where the record had preserved her. There is an irony in that. Joni spent much of her life leaving before love hardened into confinement. She left relationships, genres, cities, and expectations. She guarded autonomy so fiercely that loneliness sometimes followed her into the freedom she had chosen. Then the catastrophe made leaving impossible. She needed people nearby. Women cared for her. Friends filled the house. Musicians watched her carefully and adjusted when she needed space. Brandi Carlile helped protect a circle in which Joni could participate without pretending to be fully restored. What independence could not recover, trust slowly approached. Maybe that is what she meant in Hamilton. Not that the aneurysm was good. Not that suffering arrives with a secret reward. But that the life built after it contained something the earlier one had resisted. Permanence without imprisonment, dependence without erasure, love that remained in the room when she could offer no performance in return. The award ceremony continued. Joni joined other Canadian artists in song. The audience watched a national treasure being welcomed home. Yet somewhere beneath the celebration, the old contradictions remained. The daughter she lost could be found, but the missing childhood could not. The voice could return but not untouched. The songs could be reclaimed, but they still belonged emotionally to millions of strangers. A catastrophic mourning could produce another life, but it could not restore the person who entered it. Joni called herself a phoenix. Perhaps she was. But the most heartbreaking part of her story is not that she fell and rose again. It is that rising required her to release the identity she had spent a lifetime defending. And now when she sings, we hear two women at once. The young artist preserved inside the song, and the older woman who survived long enough to discover that she could never completely return to her. The applause tells us she is still here. It does not tell us which version of Joni Mitchell is listening to it.